So, empires, right? When we think about empires, we have a tendency to think about their end. For a long time, historians have discussed the end of empires by talking about their decline. But this might be a term that may do more injustice than clarification. Empires aren't made in a day, and they don't end in one either. To indicate that an empire declined indicates that it gradually lessened in power and did nothing to address its issues or made choices that hastened the process. At first, this logic seems simple, but should we apply it to our understanding of history? Would we call the end of the Roman Empire a decline or simply a transformation into the Byzantine Empire? Where exactly would the decline of either empire begin? One empire that normally gets slapped with the D word a lot is the Ottomans, an empire that stretched from Southeast Europe, West Asia, and North Africa, and parts of southeastern Central Europe. Historians note that pre-1990s historians had often characterized the Ottomans following 1683 in a state of decline, but more recent ideas and research argue that the Ottoman Empire was still in good shape, and to indicate that it declined means ignoring its attempts at reform and change leading towards the modern nation-state we have today. For the sake of time, I'll be mainly focusing on military reform, as it is one of the points that was previously argued by historians as evidence for Ottoman decline. One of the first problems that historians have with Ottoman decline is that there isn't exactly a starting point when the empire decides to take a look at itself in the mirror and contemplate reform. Oftentimes, historians point to the Second Siege of Vienna in 1683 as the point by which Ottoman reforms began, citing the failed siege as a singular fixed event that created a domino effect on military policy. Yet others argue that the push for reform was the realization by the Ottomans that its European neighbors had adapted its warfare techniques due to their interactions with Ottoman and their own European firepower. As handheld cannons evolved into firearms and huge cannons turned into better portable mortars, the European response to these new weapons demanded ingenuity to both enhance and counter these developments. Castles and cities previously surrounded by straight curtain walls had to adapt to new forms of defense in greater depth and design, such as slanted walls, to withstand cannon fire. Another idea argues that reforms began with Napoleon's intervention in Egypt in 1798. Napoleon's incursion had forced Sultan Selim III to declare war on France, which had once been one of the Ottomans' longtime historical allies. With Napoleon outgunning and outmatching him, Selim III turned to the British for an Anglo-Ottoman alliance against the French. Despite pushing the French out of Egypt, historians argue that military reliance on their British companion had forced the Ottomans to rethink their military policy. Then we have the historians who point to the Russo-Ottoman War of 1768 to 1774. The argument states that a defeat for the Ottomans by the Russian Empire further decreased Ottoman military capacity to maintain a presence and their influence in the Balkans. No matter which event historians believe is the starting point, it's not like the Ottomans were sitting on their butts doing nothing while these events were happening. Sultan Selim III's ascension to the Ottoman throne in 1798 introduced changes in military education with the introduction of a new school, the New Engineering School or Imperial School of Engineering. Along with the formally established Imperial School of Naval Engineering, these schools created a new core of the Istanbul Technical University. These deeply rooted science and military technology education programs promoted new forms of military education imported from France and Germany, and both schools departed from the traditional schools known as madrasas. Despite pre-1990s conceptions that the Ottoman Navy was declining, the Ottomans still had the largest fleet in the Mediterranean. The Ottomans were very slow in making the transition from galleys to galleons, but historians note that the sailing galleon did not immediately demonstrate superiority over the oar-powered galley in the mid-16th century. One possible explanation for Ottoman reluctance to adopt galleons was due to a lack of timber. Galleys were easier and cheaper to build, and it was not until Selim III that the Ottomans started using galleons instead of galleys. The Ottomans were aware of European naval advancements and attempted to incorporate new types of ships into their own fleet, such as frigates. Sultans were also starting to focus their efforts on organizing a body of troops along European norms, such as wearing European uniforms, following European drills, and living in separate barracks. Ottoman reformists shared the idea of modernizing their army, but the problem remained on how westernized the army would be. Despite the factionalism within the government, the most immediate block for Ottoman military reform was the Janissaries themselves. Once the most professional force in the empire, by the 18th century they had decayed into a cross between a militia and an organized gang. This was demonstrated during their defeat when fighting the Russian Empire in 1768, which makes some historians call the Janissaries at this time a fictional fighting force. The Janissaries proved to be a constant obstacle for military reform. Despite their lacking effectiveness in battle, their growing number had turned them into a social class. Finally, with the constant threat of the Janissaries overthrowing sultans that the Janissaries didn't favor, Sultan Mahmud II completely eradicated them in 1826 in what was deemed, because historians suck at naming stuff, the auspicious incident. The new reforms had also stripped local landlords and Tamars of their titles. New weaponry and advancements in technology made the cavalry charge and thus the Tamars no longer effective. Some of these Tamars became brigadines and bandit chiefs. The Ottomans then hired these bandits that made up mercenary units, and rather ransack at will, these units employed both violence and careful planning and organization. New reforms created a system of hired mercenary armies that both served in the army, maintained local order, and raided Ottoman rivals. However, the drawback was that unlike Tamars, these mercenary armies were not rotated, allowing them to be locally rooted. Their loyalty to the state was firm only if the state could pay them, and they established close relationships with strong patron clients. The mercenary army is argued by some historians as one of the driving factors for Ottoman decentralization. Despite the empire going through some rough times, the Ottomans remained a key player in European and Middle East politics. To say that the Ottoman Empire declined indicates that they went in a downward spiral, but that is not exactly the case. Ottoman reform, just like any other empire, was done to counter foreign or domestic issues that the empire faced. Instead of us retelling an empire's decline, we should probably try focusing on the methods an empire took to keep itself alive in the long run. Perhaps then, we can think of empires as not falling or declining, but rather transforming into the world we live in today. If you'd like to have a better overview of Ottoman history, Overly Sarcastic Productions does an awesome summary. And Extra History did some episodes on the Ottomans from their invasion of Wallachia, Suleiman the Magnificent, and the Second Siege of Vienna.